Great, thank you everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about principles for digital preservation. I'm the digital preservation librarian here at the University of Toronto, but like Ms. Nakamura, I'm also a librarian and I'm not necessarily doing digital scholarship projects. The work that I do here is concerned more with preserving the things that are going to be feeding into those projects, that scholars are going to take and create these amazing projects like what we saw this morning. And also thinking about how to preserve those things that they've created and how we can usefully steward that research into the future. So looking at it through that lens, I think we all in this room, mostly being librarians, kind of intuitively understand what we mean when we say digital preservation. The stuff that we've seen so far that has been generated by scholars or by units that's digital, we want to preserve that, right? But if we're starting to unpack the principles behind how we do that, or what some of the concerns are, I think it's useful to go back to a definition just to sort of pick it apart a little bit. And I think this is a pretty good definition. This is from the Digital Preservation Coalition, which is just a big consortium of nonprofits that concern themselves with digital heritage, right, and making sure that stuff that we have that's in digital formats kind of makes the trip through time. And I'm not going to go through and read the whole thing, but I think the first sentence actually encapsulates it pretty well, which is, it refers to a series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. Everything else is just kind of clarification of those points. And there are two things specifically that I think are worth unpacking in the context of digital scholarship here. The first is digital materials. What digital materials? If we're going to preserve them, we should probably think about the nature of those things and how we might even start to go about preserving them. And the thing about digital materials is that they are hugely varied. And I mean, these are very simple examples up here on the screen. You can see here, this is obviously a journal article, so scholarly text is one thing that we often think about in terms of digital preservation. This is a page document out of a scholarly journal. Thank you. But already and just now we've seen that even textual documents are not always so clear-cut. When you think about like long linear documents that may have, for the purposes of access, requirements to view them that don't necessarily map to those of other types of printed digital content, right? So already we're starting to see this diversity in content creep in. The other thing to highlight, which Ms. Nakamura referred to as well, especially in terms of like when we're digitizing documents and OCRing them, we've actually created now two things that sort of represent the same object. And so not only are those things, one is probably image-based for humans to look at with their eyes, but the other is this text document that may be of use for text and data mining. It may be of use for accessibility purposes. Generally, it's a machine-readable format. And those two are the same thing. And now all of a sudden we have not just one thing, but two. And we need to kind of keep track of those as a compound object now. So our digital materials are getting more complicated already. Up at the top, this is obviously a sound waveform, and the way that we store those, we often want a very high quality wave because that's our preservation copy. We want it to be in the highest quality possible because we might resample it later for making new derivatives that will be streaming online or something like that. But, again, if we're creating derivatives, we have to track why we're doing that and where they're being stored and the fact that these are the same thing. This is an image file. Image files, again, are complicated in the same way. Although, this image file actually represents something that's even more complicated, which is a piece of software. This is an image from a video game. So now thinking about how, well, if we want to preserve some sort of interactive piece of software, well, what's necessary to do that? Well, we probably need a computing environment that the software was designed to run in, and we need some way to meaningfully access that in a modern operating system that our users will probably have access to. So already you can see that we just sort of and, you know, we raise a lot more questions than we answer here. But I think this is the strength of approaching it as librarians, because I think what we've always done is sort of curate our collections in ways that make them coherent and meaningful. And I think we're in a good position to do that in terms of digital scholarship as well. So take this just incredibly wide range of requirements that we're given and say, okay, you know, we can set some standards, we can think about what it is we collect and how we collect it and how our users provide access to it. And that helps us sort of winnow down that decision making into something that is reasonable, right? So, digital materials. The other part to talk about is the as long as necessary piece. And sometimes I give this talk to libraries and librarians, like today, and other times I give this to archivists. And this is a piece that tends to resonate much more strongly with archivists, because a lot of the work that they do is subject to things like retention schedules, and there's things that they'll collect and bring in that need to be disposed of by a certain time. So that obviously is a piece of digital preservation as well, and it needs to be tracked. You know, here, this is just an example from the U of T archives, retention and disposal schedules. But things that are more relevant to libraries and the works that the digital scholarship works are here in the upper right corner, and this is actually funding requirements. So you know, we know that researchers care about funding, and the library likes for researchers to get funding. So it's in our best interest to support them in being able to comply with the requirements that the funders are giving them. So that's a space where we have to be knowledgeable as well, because it means that, you know, if we're helping a researcher comply with a requirement that their funder is handing down, we're making a commitment as well. And there's a, you know, we're making a work commitment and we're making a monetary commitment there. And then I have this nice sort of picturesque library at the bottom just to represent the fact that, you know, even absent regulatory or sort of funding requirements, you know, we make collection decisions as librarians by ourselves all the time. And I think we need to apply the same principles that we use and have used for hundreds of years in our collection building to digital content. You know, it doesn't, you know, which is to say that some stuff will be kept around for a long, long, long time, and other stuff may kind of get weeded out over time. So that's sort of unpacking, you know, what we talk about when we talk about digital preservation. And I think I don't have any like pat answers to give you as part of this presentation today. I don't think there are any pat answers. I think it's just a lens to look at various projects and various questions through. And I think if that's something that you can bring to the conversations both at the symposium today and tomorrow, and sort of when you go away and start to think about digital projects, I think that's a great outcome from the perspective of somebody who just sort of generally cares about the longevity of digital preservation, of digital information. So there is nothing wrong with this slide. But I may have thought there was another point that was too important to be left off and didn't do my due diligence. So before that was a lot of blah, 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 but I think there are a few sort of overarching principles to also remember when we think about digital preservation. And the first one is that digital preservation is not a binary state, right? As much as vendors who are out flogging specific solutions, or even open source communities who really believe in the product that they're delivering, might want you to think that, you know, you put your stuff into this system and you're good to go, man. It's not the case. We're always in the process of identifying and mitigating risks to our digital materials. And digital preservation is really, you know, in some ways it's an attribute of those decisions that we're making. Some of the decisions may move us forward on an axis where we're trying to provide access to a thing, but they may be detrimental to the longevity of the material. We just, in thinking about digital preservation in the big picture, we kind of want to move that needle toward what's good for the material, what's good for the content, as much as we can, as much as reasonable. We're always going to have to make trade-offs there. Other thing that I think is important to remember is that preservation is really access over the long term. I think maybe most people have seen that last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark where like the Ark gets socked away by the army and it's like put in the basement of this storage facility and it zooms out and it's just rows and rows and rows of boxes and it'll never be found or used again. And that's not necessarily, well, I should say that's sort of the implication there by that like long panning out shot is that no one will ever find this again. And that like implied destiny is not what we want for our digital materials either. If we're preserving something, and again, we're putting resources into doing that, we want to be adding value to the work and the research that our communities are doing. So I think it's, you know, we can't just put things into a black box and run fixity checks on them and say, okay, it's still there. We really do have to think about how people are going to access and how people are going to use it, because if we don't, that stuff just sort of drifts away into this space where we're still paying to preserve it and, you know, keep it whole and integral, but nobody's using it. And you quickly sort of get away from being able to justify that. So I think that's overall a very important thing to remember. And then finally, I've sort of talked around this several times now, but digital preservation is a resource-constrained activity. I mean, and it's not unique to digital preservation. Collection building is this way too, right? But when we think about digital preservation, anytime we make a choice, oh, we're going to preserve this thing, we are literally making a decision not to preserve something else because we only have a finite amount of resources. So it's up to us as institutions and organizations and people who are building research collections to think about whether or not we're preserving the right things. And I think that's just a really important point to remember as we go through this process. In terms of evaluating, you know, so great, I've given all these principles and now you have like, wow, big ideas to think about, but it's not really that useful in terms of saying, okay, well, we want to embark on a project to digitize a certain text, or, you know, we have a researcher who's coming in, who's producing these amazing digital scholarship projects. How do we engage with that? I think a pretty useful framework for engaging with you know, digital preservation actions and digital preservation platforms is this three-legged stool approach. Have people seen this before? Yeah, some. So like this is Nancy McGovern's three-legged stool approach from her digital preservation management workshop, which is amazing, and you should go to that workshop if you have any interest or if you're called on to work in this space. So she basically characterizes digital preservation activity sort of as this top of the stool, right? And the stool is held up by three legs, which are technology, the organization, and resources. And I think in thinking about any action that we're going to take on digital materials, I think it's worthwhile to just walk through and think about these three things as you're doing it, right? So the first, and I think probably the most important is the organization, right? Because without the weight of an organization behind you, you're just sort of off doing your own thing. You have to think about whether or not, as a library, it's within your mandate to collect and preserve the material that you're looking at. The image that was on a few slides back of the picture from the video game is actually part of a sort of an independent research project that I'm interested in around like gotcha video games. U of T weirdly is not that interested in that material and probably is not going to put that many resources into preserving the work that comes out of it. So, so that's a concern for me as a researcher to think about, okay, well, where does this go from here? But, as librarians, then we need to think about, okay, what is it in our best interest to collect? Because this is going to support, either areas of strength that we have established as a program, or these are collections that we're well known for, or it's something that we want to develop. There are a lot of reasons you can do that, but it should be coherent with like the overall organizational strategy. And this is really just the policy stuff again that Ms. Noguchi was talking about in terms of like the Princeton Library framework for digital preservation. Somebody who probably had a job very similar to me was like, oh, We need to figure out, make sure that we're collecting the right stuff. Oh, we don't want any wasted efficiency here. So it's, you know, but in reality, those things have to exist because otherwise the institution isn't going to be able to justify the expenditure of resources. Resources. I've talked around this quite a lot, but you do need to understand before taking on any preservation project or preservation of anything that a researcher or faculty member has produced, that you understand that there's a resource cost to this, and that resource cost is going to come at the expense of something else. And then finally, the technology. And I saved this for last. I don't talk about this very much in this presentation, even though I come from a technology background and have implemented a lot of these repositories because you're already going to have enough advice and people telling you what to do in this space that I don't think you need somebody else standing up here telling you what to do in this space. I think, you know, all I can say is that it's important to think about whether or not it's supportable given the resources of your institution, and whether or not it supports long-term access to the digital materials, right? So hearkening back to the conversation about what is the stuff, you know, and what do you need to access it? You know, are the specific technology platforms that you're looking at going to actually be able to provide meaningful access? So, in closing, if I can sum up these points, basically, you know, thinking about the nature of the materials, the requirements, not just of the specific content, but also the users that you see using that material, is probably paramount in any preservation initiative. Second, you know, the longevity of any preservation solutions, because you're going to pour a lot of time and energy and money into implementation of some solution, and you don't want to have to replace it next year or like 2 years down the line. That's, you know, that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different scenarios. Sometimes that means it's worth paying a lot of money for something that's big but robust, and other times it means that, you know, it's kind of worth kicking down the road with a get-by kind of solution. It just depends on the material and where you're at as an organization. And then finally, I would say when you're thinking about preservation solutions, organizational suitability, technological capability, and financial stability are really kind of the 3 key points, and there you can't do any sort of digital preservation without those points. And please, please, please do remember that it's not something that's ever done. It's not this binary state. We're doing the best we can. We're a link in a chain that stretches like back in time and that stretches forward, we hope, in time as well. And all we can do is kind of manage risks until the next handoff to another custodian or another system or another grant or whatever it is. So that's all that I have to say around this. This is my contact information. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions either now or at the end of the day, or if you want to email me, it doesn't matter. The link at the bottom too is a link to our digital preservation policy. So one of the things that I've done fairly recently here at the University of Toronto is to implement a central digital preservation policy, and that link is where you can get a hold of the most recent draft. Thank you very much.